Welcome back to Turning Hard Times into Good Times. I'm your host, Jay Taylor, and I'm glad to have with me once again Dr. Quinton Hennigh. He's the president and CEO of one of my favorite companies, namely Novo Resources. Well, Dr. Hennigh is a seasoned veteran exploration geologist. He's worked with major mining companies in the past. He's highly respected among his peers. There are two reasons why Novo is one of my favorite gold stocks at this time. First, it appears to hold the potential for early gold production with prospects for very robust economics. But secondly, and from a longer-term perspective, Novo Resources appears to have the potential for discovering a major deposit along the lines, potentially at least, of a Witwatersrand deposit. For those of you who aren't familiar with the Witwatersrand in South Africa, it is singly the largest gold occurrence discovered in the history of humankind. So it is a very remarkable deposit. Dr. Whitney, as we've explained on this show before, has really, after studying the rocks of the Witwatersrand rocks and the geology, he has found this area in northwestern Australia that he believes has the potential to host another major Witwatersrand-like deposit. Novo trades in Toronto under the symbol NVO, and you can buy it in the United States, as I have, under the symbol NSRPF. There are approximately 74.2 million shares outstanding. Stock has been trading down like most gold stocks have. It closed in the U.S. at around 34 cents in U.S. money, having a market cap of around $25 million $25 million U.S. Dollars at this point in time. Welcome, Quinton. Thank you for joining me again today.
Yeah, thank you very much, Jay.
Really always good to get an update on Novo Resources, my favorite gold stock. You know, the greatest gold deposit, as I just sort of mentioned, was discovered in South Africa quite a while ago, I guess towards the end of the previous century. It's known as the Witwatersrand. I don't know if it's a third or a fourth or a half of all the gold that's been produced by mankind. It's a major portion of all the gold that's ever been produced has come out of there. And based on your studies of Witwatersrand rock, in your days at Newmont and your studies at Colorado School of Mines, you identified the Pilbara region in northwestern Australia as a likely area in the world where another Witwatersrand-type deposit may be found. Now, you've spent several years there now, Quinton, exploring that region, and the last we talked, from a geological point of view, you were still very encouraged. Do you still think there is a potential to find another rich monster deposit similar to the Witwatersrand at your Beaton's Creek project in Australia or in that general area?
Yes, Jay, I do. I've stuck with this project for a number of years, as you said. It's not something you find overnight. It is a very large system, and we've faced this challenge with the downturn in the gold market. But at the same time, I remain quite optimistic. You know, the beauty of rocks is they don't change. They don't care what goes on in the markets. They pretty much stay in the ground. So as far as the evidence we have, the supporting evidence for the potential here, I feel just as enthusiastic today as I did 10 years ago.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I think I'll touch on a few things that you mentioned. And this really is for background, if anything,
sure,
about the Witwatersrand. I would say one of the questions I get a lot is, not questions, but I guess misconceptions I see a lot, is that the Witwatersrand, which hosts these conglomerate horizons, is completely underlain by those horizons. Mm-hmm. If you just Google Witwatersrand and gold field or something to that effect, and look for a map of the Witwatersrand basin, you'll see that only a small percentage of the basin is actually underlain by the gold fields there. Mm-hmm. It might be 1 or 2% of the overall basin as in its entirety. Mm-hmm. Well, here in the Pilbara, we have in Novo's bailiwick, we have about 1,800 square kilometers, and we're focused at Beaton's Creek, which is near the town of Nullagine right now. I think that we have that kind of potential to find something like a Witwatersrand goldfield in this basin. The Nullagine sub-basin is on the order of 1,500, 2,000 square kilometers, something to that effect. Mm-hmm. And we've already kind of latched into the outcropping portion of the system, and I see good evidence that these reefs continue at depth So yes, I think we have that kind of potential.
Yeah, and you actually put a deep hole down that sort of discouraged people that weren't that well tuned into into the geology of this system. But you gained encouragement from that deep hole, even though it didn't grade economic. It showed you that that this reef system extended quite a ways away from where you're working now, right?
Correct. That was about 3 or 4 kilometers out. I considered it a distal environment. Looking at the geology that we encountered in that hole, I would say it's telling us a couple of things. One is that along the better exploration target is probably along what would be the eastern boundary of the subbasin. So we're going to pull, once we get back to testing these deeper reaches, we're going to pull back in and test that eastern margin more closely. The other thing is, of course, we have nuggety gold, so it just adds to the complexity of evaluating these kind of deposits. You can drill a hole in one spot and drill a hole a meter away, and you can have a nugget in one sample and no nugget in the other. Mm-hmm. It doesn't discourage me in the least. In fact, it encourages me because I can tell you now that there's gold 3 or 4 kilometers out from the area we've already drilled. I mean, that's astounding in my opinion.
Yeah, exactly. Well, Quinton, though, when you're talking about finding something large, it can take a lot of time. And one of the things, as I mentioned when I was just introducing you again, that I like about your story is that you have prospects for coming to production, getting this project into production fairly quickly. Can you give us a little idea of why and how you might be able to get this into production? I think you're thinking the chances are very good that you can have this in production perhaps within the next year. Why should people believe this is possible? After all, most people would say, yeah, it sounds like another Vancouver stock story. But why could this actually be possible? Why could it actually be that you could produce gold within a very short period of time of having made this discovery?
Sure thing. So, firstly, I would encourage people to look at our presentation. There's some pictures in our presentation on our website that show information about the geometry and the potential ease of mining this, as well as the potential for very simple gravity recovery. You can get a very good feel for what we're trying to tackle here just based on the slides in that presentation. But to back up, so like I said a minute ago, we've latched on to the outcropping part of this mm-hmm. system. It's an area that's roughly 3 or 4 square kilometers, which is underlain by shallow, thoroughly oxidized gold-bearing conglomerate horizons. And these horizons are on the order of 1 meter to 2 meters thick. They're interstratified in some places, so you get a stack of these things. Other places, they've basically condensed down into one sheet-like deposit. But all of those reefs are within, say, a few meters of surface. The material is heavily oxidized and weathered so that it's quite soft. We can rip it with a bulldozer, at least in concept. We envision no drilling, no blasting. We envision highly selective mining, minimal dilution. We can see recovery of the gold out of the conglomerates by screening out the large barren boulders within the material. Just focusing on the matrix. So, basically we see a very robust case for developing a mine here. A lot of people, as you said, they might view us with a bit of a skepticism, I guess. They might say, well, gee, here you got an exploration geologist trying to put together an operating mine. Actually, I've built a team around a gentleman named Simon Pooley. He's an Australian. He's built many small mines in his career. He actually built the mine straight across the road from us that belongs to Millennium Minerals. Simon knows this project. He decided to join us based on the merits of this project, and because he knows the locals, he knows the mining permitters here in WA and so forth. We're at a great advantage to move this thing forward. We have a very strong team at this point with Simon and some of his counterparts, as well as right now in Perth, there isn't a lot of work. So you have a lot of engineers who are quite hungry, mm-hmm. and fortunately we've been able to pick sort of the cream of the crop to help us with this project.
Oh, that sounds very promising. Now, you mentioned, I think you sort of sort of implied some of the factors from a mining perspective, low mining costs. You mentioned the nuggeting effect, and you've done a lot of sort of bulk samples that you've done. I guess channel samples might be what people think of, so that
Correct.
you could eliminate this statistical problem of the nuggeting effect. Can you give our listeners some sense of what sort of average grades you might expect coming out of that based on the work that you've done so far?
Yeah, sure. I'm actually going to give a little bit more than that. So winding the clock back about 2 or 3 years ago when we were first drilling here, we didn't recognize the severity of the nugget issue. Mm-hmm. We there was coarse gold, but we didn't realize that essentially all of it is coarse gold. So when we were taking samples, we were collecting relatively small samples at the drill rig. We were taking relatively small samples at the lab and then processing them to evaluate how much gold was in the samples. The data that was produced from that, it was a bit mixed. You could tell that some samples would get a nugget, some samples wouldn't. It was very hard to compare from hole to hole values and things like this. We knew there were some issues, so we worked with technical folks at Newmont who happened to be a large shareholder, and we came up with a sampling protocol last year that would be robust enough to evaluate the gold grades of this type system. And we went back, and when we drilled last year, we collected very large samples at the drill rig. We're now processing very large samples in the lab. We've almost got all of those done. We've got a large number of trench samples, or channel samples as you call them, out of open cuts, actual surface samples. And we can now evaluate better the grades that we're seeing. We've seen a significant jump in grades from, say, the drilling 2 or 3 years ago to now. We see a further increase in grades as we get some of this new data back with these very large 3-kilogram leach wells. For instance, last news release I put out, I show in there that statistically we're seeing about a 33%, about a third increase in gold grades over previous assays. We've got a bunch of what are called GRG, gravity gold recovery samples in the lab at this time. We get 50 of them, and once we get that data back, we'll show to the world that the calculated head grades for this nuggety gold mineralization are actually quite robust. We think that the oxide resource we're going to put out will be on the order of around 3 grams per ton.
Mm-hmm. And that's pretty remarkable when you look at open pit grades or near surface mining these days, which in many cases are less than 1 gram per ton sometimes. So, of course, all systems are different. All projects are different. You mentioned the oxides. I think you've talked about free milling in the past. So this really, as I understand it, your capital costs are expected to be very low because of the simplicity of the recovery of the gold in this system. That's at least at this stage what you believe to be true, right?
Correct. Yes, it's both the capital costs to develop a gravity plant are quite low, and as well as the operating costs, which are also quite low. We're not talking about using chemicals or cyanide here. We're talking about permitting and building a small gravity plant and operating very simple equipment that is not energy intensive, say.
Mm-hmm.
Yep.
Very important. Well, nothing is easy, especially in markets like this for mining projects. What do you consider to be your major risks going forward here? I mean, if your capital costs are low, your operating costs are low, but something tells me, as a guy that's been around this industry for 3 or 4 decades, that nothing is easy, especially in markets like this. What are some of the major risks that you might still face here yet, Quinton, in getting this up and running into a profitable project?
Jay, I'm glad you asked that because, with mining, there's always stuff that keeps you up at night. And, if I had to answer right now what keeps me up at night, it's not necessarily any technical issues or even permitting issues or whatever at our project. I actually feel very confident this time. We're getting the data that we need, and we're seeing what we like. So on that front, not too worried. really concerns me right now is the state of the gold market.
Yeah.
We have what I think is an incredible, potentially high margin gold project here, and it would just be a heartbreaker to see gold go to 1,000. And we have one of the better gold projects I think could be in operation around the planet. Gold's trading for a discount. What concerns me is finding the interest and so forth in this gold market for shareholders to come back to the sector. It's brutal. We have to capitalize this thing in a few months. I am looking at ways to capitalize it. Fortunately, we've got a very good support. I've got a number of groups who they're actually quite technically savvy, looking at the project, and these are what I would call smart money. So yeah, we're definitely looking ahead and trying to get this thing moving as quickly as possible. But this gold market is an absolute bear.
Oh, it is absolutely one of the worst bears that I've witnessed in 30 plus years in this business. No question about that. But certainly, I guess at some point in time you'll have a better handle on the actual cost of production. I mean, it's not inconceivable in my view, and I don't know if I'm off base in saying this or not, but that some projects may still make money at $1,000 an ounce if it were to go there. I guess it's too early to say whether that would be true with yours, but when I look at 3 grams per ton, if that proves to be true, if I look at lower operating costs than most, look at low capital costs, who knows, but I guess we'll find out in due course. What are some of the drivers, Quinton, that people should be looking for right now, and what are some of the achievements that you've had on your project recently? I guess the bulk sampling results are certainly one of them, but could you just sort of summarize what your most recent achievements and what people should be looking forward to going forward here in terms of drivers that could cause the stock to rise even in a bear market?
Sure thing. So we have what I think is, again, it has the potential for being a very, very high margin deposit. Gold goes to 1,000. This project should be all right. I don't want to sell gold at 1,000. That would be a very big disappointment. But what we're doing over the next few months, what we are trying to accomplish and as quickly as possible is to get our resource out. This requires a few more assays that have yet to come back. I will be putting those out probably in the next week or two. The resource should be ready in the next, say, 8 weeks, we'll call it. Then we have done a lot of economic work already. We can't publish it because we have to get the resource out. There's kind of a proper order to do things, but we should have a lot of that data already in hand. So by later this year, we will be able to put some economics to the resource. The other things that we've got coming out, I've got a bunch of GRG tests. These are the gravity gold recovery tests, and I think once those numbers come out, people will see very easily that we should have very good recovery, as well as get a better feel for the grade of this system. Those are what I would call the short-term objectives between now and the end of the year. We want to put together a very compelling case for a very high margin project here in WA, and it's really the first stage in what we see as a project that could grow over time. We can then tackle, start looking at the sulfide once we have cash flow, potential cash flow out of this operation, and so forth and so on. It's something we're going to build.
No, it is certainly a very most unusual project and one of the most exciting ones that I've found in 30, 40 years of following this industry. Very unique, and the stock has been bludgeoned like most have. I think that really smart operators, the Rick Rules of this world, Creasy's of this world, various people who have really made a lot of money in this sector have done so when nobody else wants to go near them. And I can't remember a period of time when there's been more bearish sentiment than right now, Quinton. So at the same time, technically, from what I understand of the project, it looks very, very promising. So I'm really pulling for you. I've got a lot of shares for myself in this project, so I have a selfish interest in seeing it succeed. Clearly, I really hope you do, and thank you very much. Anything else you'd like to add before we conclude our discussion today?
Well, let's just hope that the gold price stops going down. I think a lot of people have come out and said we're at the bottom and this and that. I think bottoms are best viewed in a rear view mirror. You've hit a bottom when you can look back and say, yep, that was the bottom.
Yeah.
And I think we're getting close to that stage, but it might require a little bit more patience.
You just never know. Well, thank you very much, Quinton, for being with us once again. Always a pleasure talking to you. And we'll look forward to updating our listeners once again in maybe 8 weeks or so once you get the resource. That would be great to have you back then.